There is a fish in northern Australia that looks as though it was designed to frighten anything that comes too close. It can grow to more than 6.5 meters in length, making it one of the largest fish capable of entering freshwater in Australia, and projecting from the front of its head is a long, flattened rostrum lined with sharp teeth that gives the animal its unmistakable appearance. To anyone seeing it for the first time, it looks less like an ordinary fish and more like a prehistoric weapon moving silently beneath the surface. Yet despite its size and extraordinary appearance, this animal is becoming increasingly difficult to find across much of its former range. It has not disappeared because another predator has defeated it, and there is no evidence that the fish has somehow lost the ability to hunt. Instead, the environments that have supported it for thousands of years are changing, and the consequences are particularly serious for a species whose life depends on the connection between rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters. This is the largetooth sawfish, Pristis, often known as the freshwater sawfish, and its story begins with the strange weapon that has made it one of the most recognizable fish in Australia's tropical waterways. The saw-like structure extending from its head is called a rostrum, and although it looks like a simple blade, it is much more sophisticated than that. Along both sides are rows of specialized rostral teeth, while within the rostrum are sensory organs capable of detecting weak electrical signals produced by other animals. This ability, known as electroreception, is shared with sharks, rays, and other members of the cartilaginous fish group, and it gives the sawfish an advantage in environments where vision can be severely limited. Northern Australian rivers can become extremely turbid, particularly during periods of heavy rainfall and flooding, and in such conditions an animal cannot always rely on its eyes to locate prey. The sawfish has another source of information. Electrical activity produced by the muscles and nervous systems of nearby animals can be detected by specialized receptors, allowing the fish to sense the presence of potential prey even when the water is too cloudy for clear vision. The rostrum can then be used as a hunting weapon. When a prey animal comes within range, the sawfish can move its head and rostrum from side to side, striking or injuring the target before turning beneath it and feeding. Its diet can include other fish as well as bottom-dwelling invertebrates, so the saw is not simply an intimidating feature that happens to make the animal look dangerous, it is a functional part of a highly specialized feeding system. This creates an important misconception about the species. It is easy to look at a 6-meter fish carrying a saw across its face and assume that its greatest advantage is strength, but the real advantage is information. The sawfish has evolved a way of detecting living animals in an environment where ordinary vision may be unreliable, and that ability has allowed it to exploit habitats that would be difficult for many other predators. The young sawfish are particularly associated with freshwater and estuarine environments. During the early part of their lives, juveniles can spend several years in rivers, billabongs, and connected wetlands before gradually moving towards estuarine and coastal waters as they grow. The species therefore does not belong exclusively to freshwater, despite the common name, because its life cycle crosses the boundary between inland waterways and the sea. That distinction is crucial because the survival of the species depends on more than simply having water in a river. The right habitats have to remain connected, seasonal flooding has to continue providing access to nursery areas, young fish need suitable places to feed and shelter, and adults eventually need access to the environments where they can continue their life cycle. The river is therefore not just the place where the sawfish happens to live. It is part of the biological system that produces the next generation. One of the most important places for understanding that system is the Fitzroy River in Western Australia. The Fitzroy is a vast tropical river whose character changes dramatically between the wet and dry seasons. During the wet season, heavy rainfall can cause the river to expand across its floodplain, connecting areas that may remain isolated for much of the year. For a young sawfish, these changes can create access to feeding grounds and nursery habitat that would otherwise be unavailable. When the water recedes, the landscape changes again. Channels become narrower, floodplain areas dry out, and aquatic animals become concentrated into permanent pools and deeper sections of the river. The difference between these two seasons is not merely a visual change in the landscape, it can directly affect whether young sawfish successfully enter the population. Research in the Fitzroy River has demonstrated a strong relationship between wet season flooding and sawfish recruitment. In years when flooding is substantial, more young sawfish can enter the nursery system, while weak flooding can result in much lower recruitment. In other words, the future of a fish that may eventually grow beyond 6 meters can be influenced by something as basic as how much water reaches the right parts of a river during the wet season. That is one of the most remarkable facts about this species. The adult looks almost indestructible, but the population depends on processes that are surprisingly delicate. A giant fish carrying a powerful hunting weapon can still depend on a flood arriving at the right time and reaching the right habitat. The behavior of juvenile sawfish provides another glimpse into this relationship with the river. Studies using acoustic tracking have shown that young animals do not simply move randomly through the water. Their activity can change between day and night, with juveniles often using deeper runs and pools during daylight and becoming more active in shallower areas around dusk and during the night. This behavior is consistent with the need to balance feeding opportunities against safety. Shallow water can provide access to prey, while deeper areas and structures such as large pieces of woody debris can provide refuge. The fish is therefore constantly responding to the conditions around it, adjusting where and when it moves according to the availability of food, shelter, and suitable water. When the dry season becomes prolonged, the situation becomes more difficult. As water levels fall, the amount of available habitat can shrink considerably, concentrating aquatic animals into smaller areas. Research on sawfish in the Fitzroy has found that their body condition can decline during the long dry season, particularly in years when wet season flooding has been weaker. Reduced flooding can affect the productivity and availability of habitat, leaving the animals with fewer opportunities to obtain the resources they need. This is an important point because it changes the way we should interpret the movement of these fish. When a sawfish leaves an area, it does not necessarily mean that it has been frightened away. It may simply be following the water, searching for suitable habitat, responding to seasonal changes, or moving as part of its normal life cycle. A juvenile may move towards deeper water as the dry season progresses, while a mature animal may eventually leave freshwater and enter estuarine or coastal habitat. The same outward appearance, a fish disappearing from one location, can therefore have very different causes. Sometimes movement is normal. Sometimes movement is a response to environmental pressure. And sometimes the absence of a fish is a warning that the habitat has become less suitable. Understanding which of these is happening requires scientists to follow the animals rather than relying only on occasional sightings. Modern tracking technology has made that possible through acoustic telemetry, which allows researchers to monitor individual fish and determine how they use different parts of a river over time. These studies have shown that sawfish movement is closely connected with the physical environment. The fish responds to water depth, seasonal conditions, habitat structure, and the availability of suitable areas, creating a detailed picture of an animal that is far more behaviorally flexible than its intimidating appearance might suggest. But the sawfish faces another problem, and this one has nothing to do with its natural predators. Its own anatomy can make it particularly vulnerable to fishing nets. A net does not need to be designed to catch a sawfish in order to threaten one. When the rostrum enters a section of netting, the teeth can become caught in the mesh, and the animal may then struggle in an attempt to escape. Because sawfish are large and powerful, this struggle can make entanglement even more dangerous, increasing the risk of injury or death. The irony is difficult to miss. The same structure that evolved to help the sawfish detect and capture prey can become a liability when it encounters modern fishing equipment. This is one reason bycatch is such a serious conservation problem for sawfishes around the world. A fishing operation does not have to target sawfish deliberately for the species to be affected. An animal simply has to encounter the wrong piece of equipment in the wrong place. And because the large-toothed sawfish is a slow-growing species that takes many years to reach sexual maturity, the loss of mature individuals can have consequences that continue long after the original capture. Sexual maturity is generally reached at around 8 to 10 years, although the exact timing can vary between individuals and populations. This means that replacing a mature animal is not a matter of months. A young fish has to survive for years before it becomes capable of contributing to reproduction. For a population already under pressure, that creates a difficult mathematical problem. If mature animals are removed faster than young animals can survive and grow into adults, the population can continue declining even when some young fish are still being produced. This is why appearances can be deceptive. A 6-meter sawfish looks like the last animal that should require protection, but physical size has very little to do with how quickly a population can recover. What matters is how many animals survive to reproduce, how many young are produced, and how many of those young survive long enough to become adults. The large-toothed sawfish has already disappeared from much of its former global range, and populations in many regions have declined severely. Northern Australia remains particularly important because it still supports some of the most significant remaining populations, making the rivers and coastal environments of this region critically important to the future of the species. The Fitzroy River is especially valuable because it provides researchers with an opportunity to study sawfish within a functioning tropical river system. The animals are still present, juveniles can still be tracked, and the relationship between flooding and recruitment can still be observed. But that does not mean the population is secure. A functioning river can still be affected by changes in water availability, habitat degradation, fishing interactions, and broader environmental pressures. The species is vulnerable precisely because it needs several different parts of the ecosystem to remain functional at the same time. This is where the common name freshwater sawfish can create another misunderstanding. The species is not confined to freshwater throughout its entire existence. Its life cycle connects freshwater rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters, and the movement between these environments is part of its natural biology. Imagine protecting a nursery river while ignoring the estuary connected to it. The young fish may have a safe place to grow, but the adults could still encounter dangerous conditions later in life. Conversely, protecting coastal habitat cannot compensate for the loss of freshwater nursery areas where young sawfish spend their early years. The animal does not recognize the boundaries that humans draw between freshwater conservation and marine conservation. For the sawfish, they are parts of one continuous landscape. This is also why changes to river flow can have such profound consequences. A river can still contain water while functioning very differently from the river that existed before. The timing of floods can change, the duration of high water can be reduced, and the amount of water remaining during the dry season can become different. For a species whose recruitment is closely associated with flooding, these changes can affect the next generation long before anyone notices a dramatic decline in adults. That is one of the most dangerous aspects of sawfish conservation. The warning may arrive years after the underlying problem begins. An adult fish can remain alive for a long time, creating the impression that the population is healthy even when fewer young animals are successfully entering the system. By the time the number of adults begins to fall noticeably, the processes responsible for producing those adults may already have been damaged for years. This is why scientists pay so much attention to juveniles, recruitment, and habitat conditions rather than simply counting large fish. The future of the species is hidden in the nursery. A river that still contains a few enormous adults may look healthy, but the more important question is whether it is still producing young fish that will eventually replace them. That is the difference between survival and recovery. A species can remain alive without being secure. And this is where the story of the sawfish becomes much larger than the animal itself. The species is an indicator of the condition of the ecosystems through which it moves. It feeds on other aquatic animals, occupies freshwater and coastal habitats, and depends on seasonal processes that connect different parts of the landscape. When sawfish disappear from a river, the loss is therefore not necessarily an isolated event. It can be evidence that something much larger has changed. Perhaps the flood regime has altered. Perhaps nursery habitat has been lost. Perhaps fishing mortality has increased. Perhaps the river has become disconnected from areas that young animals once used. Or perhaps several of these pressures are acting at the same time. The frightening appearance of the sawfish can make it easy to think of the animal as a self-sufficient predator, but in reality it is deeply dependent on the wider ecosystem. The saw itself cannot solve every problem. Electroreception cannot compensate for habitat loss. Size cannot prevent bycatch. And a powerful swimming ability cannot create water where there is none. This is the central paradox of the species. The large-toothed sawfish is extraordinarily well adapted to its natural environment, yet that adaptation does not protect it from rapid changes to the environment itself. Evolution gave it the ability to survive in muddy rivers, detect prey through electrical signals, move through shallow and deep water, tolerate dramatic seasonal changes, and eventually travel between freshwater and coastal environments. But evolution did not give it a response to synthetic fishing nets. It did not give it a way to restore a degraded river. It did not give it control over the amount of water flowing through a catchment. And it certainly did not give it a way to predict what humans would do to its habitat. That is why the species can appear so powerful and still be so vulnerable. Its greatest enemy is not necessarily another animal. It is the gradual loss of the conditions that make its life cycle possible. This is also why the phrase running away is so misleading. A sawfish moving downstream is not necessarily fleeing. A juvenile moving towards deeper water is not necessarily frightened. An adult entering coastal waters is not necessarily abandoning the river. Movement is part of its biology. The real question is whether the animal still has somewhere suitable to move to. If a juvenile leaves a shallow area because the dry season has reduced the available habitat, it needs another suitable area nearby. If an adult moves towards an estuary, it needs a functioning connection between river and coast. If a fish becomes entangled in a net, however, movement is no longer a choice at all. That distinction is crucial. A healthy ecosystem allows movement. A damaged ecosystem forces movement without necessarily providing somewhere safe to go. And when that happens repeatedly, the population begins to suffer. The sawfish is therefore a remarkable example of how conservation has changed. Protecting a species is no longer simply a matter of protecting individual animals. For animals with complex life cycles, conservation must also protect the physical processes that allow those animals to exist. For the large-toothed sawfish, that means maintaining important freshwater habitats, preserving natural river functions where possible, protecting nursery areas, maintaining connectivity between rivers and estuaries, reducing accidental capture in fishing gear, and ensuring that enough mature individuals survive to reproduce. None of these measures sounds as dramatic as the image of a giant sawfish striking prey in muddy water, but these are the things that determine whether the species continues to exist. The most spectacular part of the animal is its rostrum. The most important part of its survival is the river. That may be the greatest lesson hidden in this species. We are naturally drawn towards the visible feature, the enormous saw, the 6-meter body, the prehistoric appearance. Yet the future of the animal depends on things that are much harder to see: seasonal flooding, water quality, habitat connectivity, juvenile recruitment, and the survival of adults over many years. The animal itself is only the final result of all those processes working together. If the river functions, the sawfish can grow. If the river floods in the right way, young fish can enter the population. If habitat remains connected, animals can move between the environments they need. If fishing mortality is reduced, adults can survive long enough to reproduce. And if enough of these conditions continue for long enough, the species can persist. The opposite is equally true. If recruitment repeatedly fails, the population ages. If adults are repeatedly removed, reproduction declines. If nursery habitat becomes unsuitable, fewer young animals survive. If connectivity is lost, the life cycle becomes fragmented. Eventually, the river may still contain water, fish and wildlife, but the sawfish disappears. That disappearance can be deceptively quiet. There may be no dramatic final moment. No single event that announces the extinction of a population. Instead, there are fewer sightings, fewer juveniles, fewer adults, and increasingly large gaps on the map. Then one day, someone looks at an old record and realizes that the animal has not been seen there for years. That is how many declines become visible. Not when the species begins to disappear, but when people finally realize that it is already gone from somewhere it once inhabited. For the largetooth sawfish, northern Australia remains a critical opportunity to prevent that process from continuing. The species is still present. Researchers can still study it. Juveniles can still be found in rivers. Flooding can still create nursery habitat. And conservation efforts can still influence the conditions that determine whether the next generation survives. That is an important distinction. This is not simply a story about an animal that has already been lost. It is a story about an animal that is still here, but whose future depends on whether its environment remains functional. And perhaps that is why the sawfish is so important. It forces us to look beyond appearances. A creature that looks like a weapon can still be vulnerable. A predator that can grow beyond 6 meters can still depend on a juvenile nursery only a fraction of that size. An animal that can move between freshwater and the sea can still be trapped by a net. And a species that has survived for millions of years can still be threatened by changes that have occurred within a very short period of human history. The sawfish does not need us to make it stronger. It does not need a larger saw. It does not need sharper teeth. It needs the environmental conditions that allowed those adaptations to evolve in the first place. It needs functioning rivers, connected habitats, sufficient seasonal water, access to food, and enough adults surviving long enough to reproduce. That may sound ordinary, but for the sawfish, these ordinary conditions are everything. Picture the Fitzroy River during the wet season once again. Rain has fallen across the catchment, the river has risen, and water has spread into areas that are dry for much of the year. Beneath the surface, young sawfish are moving through newly available habitat, feeding and sheltering among the structures of the river. Their eyes are of limited use in the cloudy water, but their rostral electroreceptors are constantly receiving information from the world around them. A small fish moves nearby. The sawfish detects the electrical signal. It turns towards the source. Its rostrum sweeps through the water. For the animal, nothing about this moment is extraordinary. It is simply doing what its species has evolved to do. But the existence of that animal in that place tells us something extraordinary. The river is still functioning well enough to support one of the most specialized predators in Australia's freshwater ecosystems. The nursery still works. The food web still works. The water still connects enough of the landscape. The animal has somewhere to move. That is why every remaining sawfish matters. Not because it is a monster, and not because its appearance makes for an impressive photograph, but because its presence represents a functioning relationship between water, habitat, and life. The real tragedy would not be seeing fewer giant sawfish. It would be reaching a point where the river can no longer produce them at all. Because once the last generation disappears, the saw itself cannot be replaced. A preserved rostrum can hang on a wall for decades. A museum specimen can survive long after the animal that carried it is gone. Photographs can remain. Scientific records can remain. But none of those things can make a living population return. Only functioning habitat can do that. And that is why the question we should be asking is not simply where the sawfish has gone. We should be asking what changed before it left. Did the floods become weaker? Did the nursery habitat shrink? Did connectivity change? Did fishing pressure remove too many adults? Did the animals simply move as part of their normal life cycle, or were they being pushed away from areas they could no longer use? These questions are more important than the idea of a frightened fish. Because the sawfish itself is not the mystery. Its biology is remarkably well understood. The mystery is whether the modern environment can continue to provide the conditions that its biology requires. The answer is not yet written. There are still important populations in northern Australia. There are still functioning rivers. There are still young sawfish entering nursery habitats. There are still scientists tracking their movements and studying how flooding affects recruitment. And there are still opportunities to reduce the threats that have contributed to their decline. That means the story does not have to end with disappearance. It can still become a story about recovery. But recovery will not come from treating the sawfish as an isolated species. It will come from recognizing the connections that allow it to survive. The river must remain a river. The flood must still reach the places where young fish grow. The nursery must remain connected to the wider system. The estuary must remain accessible. Fishing practices must reduce unnecessary mortality. And enough mature animals must survive for the population to rebuild. Only then can the sawfish continue doing what it has done for countless generations. Moving with the water. Hunting in the darkness. Growing slowly. Traveling between freshwater and the sea. And carrying that extraordinary saw through the rivers of northern Australia. So, was the fish that Instils fear really running away? Not in the way we normally imagine. It was not suddenly frightened by its own environment, and it was not defeated by a larger predator. The movement we see is often part of a much more complicated story involving seasonal behaviour, habitat conditions, migration, and the search for suitable water. But there is an uncomfortable truth hidden inside that answer. An animal can move naturally and still be moving through a world that is becoming less suitable. It can follow the river while the river changes around it. It can leave one habitat and discover that the next one is under pressure as well. And eventually, there may be fewer and fewer places left where the entire life cycle can be completed. That is what makes the large-toothed sawfish such a powerful symbol of the modern natural world. It looks ancient, but its problem is modern. It looks powerful, but its survival depends on fragile ecological connections. It carries a weapon, but that weapon cannot protect it from habitat loss. And it can travel between river and sea, yet it remains vulnerable when humans alter the pathways connecting those environments. The sawfish has already survived for an extraordinary length of time. The question is whether we can allow the rivers that support it to remain suitable for long enough for that ancient survival story to continue. Because the next time a sawfish disappears from a river, the most important question may not be where the fish went. It may be what happened to the river before it left. And if we understand that answer in time, the story of the sawfish does not have to be about an animal that ran away. It can be about an animal that stayed. A predator that continued to move through the darkness. A giant fish that continued to grow beneath the surface. And a river that remained wild enough to give the next generation somewhere to begin. If you could protect one thing for the future of the largetooth sawfish, would you focus on reducing accidental capture, protecting the freshwater nursery, or preserving the natural connection between the river and the sea? The answer may determine far more than the future of one extraordinary fish.